Hi, Nat Doig here. Welcome to this bumper edition of Weird in the Wade, all about Biggleswade's mysterious underground tunnels. I actually get to explore a cellar with tunnel entrances in it during this episode, and I take you on a walk along the river. Of course, there's also a ghost story. As it's quite a long episode, coming in at about 1 hour 20 minutes, I've attempted to add chapters to the show, and hopefully you can access them where you're listening now. So if you need to pause or go back and listen to a section again, it should be easier for you to do so. Fingers crossed it works. I hope you enjoy this episode of Weird in the Wade. Hello and welcome to Weird in the Wade, a podcast about all that's weird, wonderful and a little off kilter in the town of Biggleswade in Bedfordshire. Each episode, I'll tell you a tale of something strange and unique that has happened in this most English of market towns or its surrounding area. There's an older meaning to the word weird, which means to twist and turn. In Norse myth and in Anglo-Saxon times, this came to mean fate or destiny, all that was and is, and all that is yet to be. Whether it's tales of ghosts or flying saucer hoaxes, the big cat of Biggleswade, or the pot and poisoner, curious social history, or the Great Swan Mystery of 1935, we'll follow all the twists and turns and uncover fascinating stories that will speak to you today, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to Weird in the Wade. It's November 1933, late afternoon. The setting sun is glinting off the stationary sails of Biggleswade windmill. George hurries down St Andrew Street and onto the driveway of the Conservative Club. A pale mist creeps from the River Ivel, slinking across the club's lawn. George shivers and hurries past the front door towards the eerie-looking mist and then around to the tradesman's entrance. He's glad to step inside the familiar old grey building. As he takes off his coat and hat, hanging them on a stand, Marjorie, the club's steward's wife, appears from the kitchens holding what looks and smells like an apple cake. She startles with shock when she sees George, her mouth making a perfect circle of surprise that George can't help but smile at.
"Oh, it's you,"
she exclaims, stopping in her tracks. "It's me," George says kindly.
"Is it that time already?"
she asks. "Afraid so," George admits.
"Will you be practising carols tonight?"
"Expect so," George nods. Marjorie seems satisfied. She spins away, calling over her shoulder as her heels clip down the tile corridor.
"Rightio, I do like a Christmas carol, and do come for a slice of cake when you're finished."
George picks up his trombone case and watches Marjorie disappear around the corner. Apple cake is his favourite. He makes his way towards the back stairs. He's a punctual man at the best of times, but he's always early for band rehearsal, so he can get some solo practice in. He doesn't like to play at home. He knows it disturbs the neighbours and suspects it annoys his wife. He's sure that the sherry-sipping regulars at the Con Club also are getting tired of the Biggleswade brass band rehearsals. After Christmas, they'll need to look for somewhere else to practice. He'll have a talk with bandleader Fred about it later, he thinks. He shakes his head wearily at the thought of that future conversation when he hears muffled footsteps. It sounds like someone is coming down the back stairs straight ahead of him. This surprises him, as he's usually the first to arrive for band practice. He waits to see who will emerge. The stairs are narrow. He wants to give them space. What happens next takes only a few fleeting seconds, yet in George's mind it feels like hours. It is as if time stands still for him. He sees the boots first emerge halfway up the stairs. A fancy pair of heeled boots, good leather. George drinks all of this in. Every detail is etched into his memory. The person wearing the boots emerges like a mist diffusing, and George's heart stops. His breath catches in his throat. The man materialising before him is dressed in the soft silks and fancy lace of a Cavalier soldier. He has long curls of dark auburn hair and a mean-looking cropped beard and moustache. On his head is a wide-brimmed hat, tilted at a rakish angle. George registers something even stranger about the fellow, and that is, he is not quite solid. The noise of his boots on the stairs is not quite right either. It's muffled somehow. The Cavalier's mouth is moving, but no words emerge. His lips just release a faint buzzing, like static from a wireless. Still, George cannot breathe. He gasps, but it's as if all the air in the corridor and his lungs has been sucked away. His heart starts to beat again, though, pounding out a military tattoo. His head spins. Then he feels a new jolt of terror surge through him, because this fantastical phantom who has appeared in front of him, boots first, is brandishing a long, thin and very sharp sword. He is coming straight for George, clattering down the stairs towards him. Suddenly, George finds his breath again. He sucks in a huge lungful of air and turns on his heels and scampers like a scolded dog back the way he came. He grabs his coat and hat, not taking the time to put them on, and is out of the club and home as fast as he can manage. Later, after band practice over cake and beer, Fred, the leader and cornet player of Biggleswade Brass Band, ponders why George didn't show up for rehearsal. It's not like him to not send word when he's indisposed. It's then, whilst Marjorie is offering around more cake, that she overhears Fred's concerns.
What do you mean? George didn't turn up? I saw him arrive, half an hour early as usual. I spoke to him.
Fred looks perplexed.
You sure, Mrs. Presland?
Of course I'm sure. I spoke with him about Christmas carols. He was eyeing up this cake hungrily. He does like his cake. But come to think of it, I didn't hear him practising before you arrived. How very odd. He must have left between speaking to me and you arriving. Very peculiar indeed. What a mystery, eh? I do like a mystery. Fred is determined to check on George on his way home, and when he gets there, he finds George wrapped in his dressing gown, sitting in front of the fire in the back room of his modest house. George's wife, Ivy, is concerned. He's not right, Fred. I don't know what's up with him. He raced in here like the hounds of hell were on his heels. He muttered something about phantoms. He was clammy, and I thought he was coming down with something, so I got him wrapped up warm. I've given him a hot toddy, and well, you know he's a man of few words. He said nothing since. He's refused supper. If you can get some sense out of him, I'd be most grateful. Fred takes a seat opposite George, and for a little while they sit in companionable silence.
We missed you at band practice today, George,
Fred began. George stares into the flames. His hands tremble as they cup the beaker his hot toddy was in.
But Marjorie said she saw you arrive, spoke with you. Why did you leave? Are you feeling unwell?
George nods. It is not just his hands trembling. His left leg shudders up and down to its own inconsistent beat. More silence. Then, out of nowhere seemingly, George begins to speak. He doesn't look at Fred, but instead speaks into the fire. He recounts what he saw on the stairs, how the boots appeared first, and then a full apparition of a Civil War Cavalier emerged, clattering down the stairs towards him, sword thrust out as if he was about to run George through. Fred is silent for a long time. He doesn't believe in ghosts and spirits, though he knows many do. He doesn't think George is someone who believes in the supernatural either. George's leg is still shaking, like the men Fred saw during the Great War, the lads when they first arrived at the front, when they first heard shells exploding overhead. Many shook like George is now in front of him. Many who once were garrulous became silent. Many like George, who were quiet, became verbose with fear. Whatever George witnessed was terrifying and was real to him at least. That is one thing that Fred is sure of. Welcome. Welcome to Weird in the Wade. I'm Nat Doig, and today we're going to finally explore Biggleswade's mysterious tunnels and unearth what exactly is going on down there. Why were they built? Why were they bricked up? Why are so many strange phenomena associated with them, or the buildings that have access to them? How does a ghostly Cavalier seen in the Conservative Club link to the tunnels? The investigation has taken me along the river, into cellars, into pubs. It's not all hard work making a podcast, you know, and researching the history of Biggleswade's brass band and brewery. I've met new people along the way who have helped and shared their stories. You'll hear from them and everything else today in this bumper tunnels episode. As this episode is going to be quite long, I have made sure that you should be able to access chapters within the podcast. Just check where you're listening now, and that means that it should be easier for you to navigate around the podcast episode if you need to take a break or if you want to go back and listen to something in particular. Do stick around to the end of the episode because I'm hoping to visit the Bedfordshire archives just before this episode goes out, so may have some last minute updates to add at the end of this episode. I also wanted to let you know that we now have a Facebook page, so if you want to follow the show on Facebook, just search Weird in the Wade and you'll find us. We are on most other social media platforms as well, so if you want to follow us on social media to get extra photographs, inside information, behind the scenes posts, then do search for us online at Weird in the Wade. Our last Patreon episode, which was released in June, was all about some spooky woodland near Biggleswade called Pegnut Wood. It's an episode with lots of atmosphere with recordings from the woods where I try to find out why so many people find a bridge in the woods so disturbing to walk over. Dogs, children and adults alike all hurry through that corner of the woods. These exclusive episodes on Patreon can be yours for the price of a coffee, just £3.50 every month. Patreon listeners also are guaranteed to hear them 9 months before anyone else, and some will be completely exclusive to Patreon. If you would like to sign up to Patreon, there is a link in the show description, and all the money raised through Patreon and Ko-fi are ploughed back into the podcast. But don't worry, main episodes of Weird in the Wade will and always will be free, and at the moment, of course, they're advert free too. I want to keep adverts away from the show as long as possible, so your support on Patreon and Ko-fi is really appreciated. It really helps the podcast keep going. Now, you may well wonder why I opened an episode about the tunnels under Biggleswade with George's Cavalier ghost story, and you may be wondering how I know about it. And I promise you, we will cover all of that soon. In fact, I visited the Conservative Club earlier this month and recorded audio there for this episode. I discovered a lot more than I bargained for in their cellar. I also went back to Camden House, the subject of our last episode, to explore the Labour Hall, which was once the schoolroom there. It's rather ironic that currently at one end of the tunnel is Camden House and the Labour Hall, and at the other end of the tunnel is the Conservative Club. But before all of that, a recap. Previously on Weird in the Wade. I'll be honest with you, I've always wanted to say that. The first ever episode of Weird in the Wade was about Biggleswade's haunted pound stretcher, and it's where the mysterious tunnels first came into view. Those who worked in the shop and the hairdressers next door told me of how the bricked up tunnel entrance in both their cellars had a creepy atmosphere surrounding them. One witness contacted me to say that she could smell old-fashioned cooking coming from the bricked-up tunnel in the basement of the hairdressers. We also know that some of the staff from the Crown Inn and the Golden Pheasant pubs did not like to spend time in their cellar near the bricked-up tunnels, nor did the little dog who lives in the Golden Pheasant. I joined forces with another local historian, Beverley, who helped me piece together the route of the tunnels under Biggleswade. After visiting just about every town centre business a few years ago as a school project with her children, Beverley had plotted the tunnel's journey through the town. She made me a map, and I then developed that further into an online map which I have shared on the show blog for you, and that's Weirdinthewade.blog. The furthest east we have found a tunnel entrance is under Camden House, now a burger shack, Domino's and Loveday's Opticians, which was formerly a school. The schoolhouse behind it is now the Labour Hall, and later in this episode I have some audio from the Labour Hall as I search for signs of the old schoolroom. The tunnel then leads along the high street until we reach the market square, where it branches. One branch continues along the high street, whilst another branch goes under what is now Dee Dee's Vegan Cafe, and then across the square to the old pubs on the far side, including to what is now Boots and Poundland, but was once the Catherine Wheel pub, where the body snatchers hung out. We believe another branch of the tunnels goes off towards what is now Asda, but was once Biggleswade's large brewery. We know for certain about the branching tunnels and where they branch for two reasons. First of all, the cellar beneath Dee Dee's has 3 separate tunnel entrances in it, and I have shared video on social media and on the blog for you to see the cellar there. One of the tunnel entrances faces south to the far side of the market square, the other one faces north towards the brewery, and another one faces west. I was also told by Johnny, who owns the Surfing Cafe, which is housed in the historic Market House in Biggleswade, about evidence of the tunnels workmen found 20-odd years ago. Now, the Market House has no cellar, but when he took over the place 2 decades ago, new sewerage pipes needed to be installed and joined to the mains sewer. The workmen digging the new sewers ran into a junction of the tunnels underneath where the traffic lights currently stand on the high street. Where they stand is opposite 2 narrow passage or alleyways. One of the alleys is Abbott's Walk, which leads to the old brewery site, now Asda, and indeed, one of the tunnels at this junction that were found by the workmen led directly towards Abbott's Walk and also towards Dee Dee's Vegan Cafe. The furthest southwest the tunnels reach is underneath the Conservative Club, which was once the southernmost river wharf in Biggleswade. Then the tunnel runs north along Shortmead Street, with entrances below the old pubs along the road and to the 2 former wharves just north of the church and then at Ivelberry. Whether the church ever had a tunnel entrance is moot. Apparently, a fire rendered the basement or the crypt there impassable, and just a tiny corner of the cellar remains, or so we're told. Although the tunnel entrances are now bricked up, one man claims that in the 1960s and 70s, some were not bricked up and were accessible, and he was able to enter a tunnel from the basement of his father's shop and travel as far as the river, in one of them at least. It's also said that if you walk along the river in the winter when the water is low, you can see one of the tunnel's entrances by Ivelberry, and I took photos of the old stone wall of that wharf there in June. Unfortunately, with it being June and it was overgrown and it was impossible to see if there was a tunnel entrance there. Also, the water is currently really high. As always, these photos are on the blog, Weirdinthewade.blog. There is one final rumour that a tunnel leads all the way to Biggleswade Common, and there is a long forgotten opening on the common which is now overgrown with vegetation. I haven't had a chance yet to go and explore the area of the common where the tunnel entrance is said to be, so that will have to be for a later episode. From that geographical description of the tunnels and their journey through the town, you may be building an idea in your mind about what links these tunnels together beyond just spooky stories. Seems to be beer and water, pubs and the river, the brewery and barges. But before we explore all of that, what do the people of Biggleswade think and know about the tunnels? Vox Pops. Back in April, on a sunny Saturday morning, I went out with my field recorder and mic and interviewed a few visitors to the market square to find out what they knew about the tunnels. I was surprised by how many had not heard of them at all. So had you heard about the tunnels underneath Biggleswade Town Centre?
Tunnels?
Yeah.
No.
No, never.
And have you lived here a long time?
Since 1976.
Wow, so you've been here quite a while.
Not at all, never.
I have at St Neots because we're from St Neots.
Oh yes, St Neots definitely
Yeah.
have them, don't they?
Yeah.
No, we don't. We just come here on a Saturday to
Our
meet
daughter
our
lives
daughter.
here.
Ah, okay.
But no, we didn't know about that, but that'd be interesting.
Yeah. And the tunnels under St Neots, do you know what they were for?
There were monks weren't abbey. It was
Yeah.
an abbey, yeah.
Yeah. I did find a few people who had heard of the tunnels. Have you heard about the tunnels that are
I have,
underneath
yeah.
Biggleswade? And what have you heard?
I've heard that they run under the market square and they go to the church, apparently. And they were all filled in when they built the new bus station.
When they built the new bus
Yeah.
station. And how long have you lived in Biggleswade?
It was 1973.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Thanks a lot. So, have you lived in Biggleswade a long time?
I have my entire life.
And do you know of the rumours about there being tunnels underneath? Yes.
I have heard about them, yes.
And what have you heard about the tunnels?
I've heard that they go quite far. I remember hearing them from you a while back.
Had you heard about them before I mentioned them to you?
I think I'd heard like small parts about them, but not very much.
Yeah.
I know that there's like an entrance nearby, but I'm not sure where. I think it's under one of the pubs, possibly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. And yes, I cheated by asking my friend Alice's daughter, because of course she knew all about the tunnels. She'd heard me talking about them. Theories. Online, I have seen the following theories put forward about what the tunnels were built for, when they were built, and by whom. The tunnels were built by monks in medieval times to move wine and beer about. The tunnels were built by monks in the 16th century to hide Catholic priests in. The tunnels were built in the 17th and 18th century for smuggling. The tunnels were used by the body snatchers in the 19th century to move bodies about. One theory is that there actually aren't any tunnels, it's all just vaulted cellars. So let's tackle each of these theories in turn. Monks. I do love a ghostly monk. There were 2 monasteries within 10 miles of Biggleswade, Old Warden and Chicksands. We will be exploring the many ghost stories around Chicksands Priory later this year with special guest Damien O'Dell. But neither of these monasteries seem to have had a particular link to Biggleswade. The monastery at Old Warden, which had a vineyard dating back to medieval times, did own land near to Biggleswade, but it was at home and not near the town centre. In medieval times, monks may well have had a stake in and owned the breweries in Biggleswade and some of the farms and granges, But I have seen no evidence that the monks of Bedfordshire were running any kind of big beer operation out of the town, nor any other kind of operation. But were the monks smuggling Catholic priests and other Catholics through the tunnels in Biggleswade in the 16th century? Biggleswade and Bedfordshire in general was not a hotbed of Catholicism during the upheavals of the 16th century, where Britain flip-flopped, well certainly England flip-flopped between being a Catholic or a Protestant nation. No doubt there were notable Catholic families and sympathisers in Biggleswade, but the tunnels seem to be stopping under too many pubs, inns and beer houses for them to be about smuggling Catholic priests, although there is probably a joke there somewhere, but I won't be the one to make it. So what about smuggling? Smuggling fancy goods, wine and spirits, rather than Catholics? Well, I'm going to come back to that because I think this rumour might be nearer to the mark. Then there's the body snatchers rumour, but as the episode on the Biggleswade body snatchers back in March made clear, there's no contemporary evidence for the tunnels being used by the body snatchers, nor does it appear that the body snatchers operated more than once out of Biggleswade, and they got caught. So I think it's unlikely the tunnels were used by resurrection men, but I think the tunnels were in place by then. So it seems like a logical step for local storytellers to add the tunnels to the mix of their thrilling tales of dastardly body snatchers. And finally, the opinion that these are not in fact tunnels, just vaulted cellars. Well, I think that's how maybe some of them probably started, and I can think of some good reasons why having extensive cellars might have been a useful thing to add to when the centre of the town was rebuilt after the Great Fire. In fact, I think that might be where the tunnels were built, around the 1780s. But most of the cellars that I've seen images of are not vaulted, and the entrances are clearly bricked up doorways, rather than being an arch of a vault. But before I lay out my theory in all its speculative glory, there's a few things I need to tell you first, and we're going on a trip down the river. The River Ivel. I love walking along the River Ivel, and I recorded a soundscape for you specially for this episode. So I'm hoping to create a soundscape of the Ivel River on any typical day. You may be able to hear the distant noise of the water at the weir, and there are lots of jackdaws and some magpies squabbling in the trees. Let's head over to the weir. So we're going to cross a bridge, and we're at the weir, the famous What's in the Weir Today weir. There are, in fact, some footballs and some lids in the weir today. I will take a photograph. And we're going to cross the bridge and head north along the river. So I just paused where the Conservative Club backs onto the river, or at least I think that's where it was, and took some photographs of a sort of ivy covered bank. Now I'm guessing that's where one of the wharves originally was, but there's not much of a sign of it now. Some of the first blackberry flowers are coming out now. It's a good spot for brambling along the Ivel River. In fact, before, when I've been recording down here, I've taken shelter in a blackberry bush when it's been raining. This was when I was down here recording the Big Cat episode. I came down here with Penny to see where she had seen the big cat running across the field, and in fact
I'm right there now. There's actually lots of cow parsley, and now what I've discovered is actually pig nut growing, thanks to the Pegnut Woods episode. And now we get to a point where I'm not going to be able to carry on walking next to the riverbank because the bank fell away, and so they diverted the path. Now, I'm hoping that once I've got round to the bit where they've diverted the path, I will be able to see at least one of the other wharf sites, but I may not be able to. And in fact, to get real evidence, I may have to come back and do this in the winter.
The Ivor River runs around the western reaches of Biggleswade. It is now sandwiched between the A1 and the town, bordered by water meadows to the west. If we go back a few thousand years, the river was a marshy, fenny place. It meanders its way through the Ivor Valley from Baldock up to Tempsford, where it joins the River Great Ouse. There are many ouzes in Britain, including in Orkney, and this is because it's the Celtic or pre-Celtic word for slow-moving water or river. The Ivor's marshiness was tamed somewhat more than 1,000 years ago when mills first appeared on its banks. There is estimated to have been a watermill at Stopfold, just south of Biggleswade, on the Ivor for a millennia. And the current mill in Stopfold is still the oldest building in that town. The mills brought weirs, narrower banks and mill pools to the Ivor. The next major change that happened was during the 18th century, when part of the river was canalised, making it passable by barges, or lighters as they were called on the Ivor. They were based on the type of boats and barges which were used in the fens, and apparently were about 40 feet long. The lighters carried goods from all the way from Biggleswade up to King's Lynn and the North Sea. We know that Biggleswade had 3 wharves to manage the loading and unloading of goods from these lighters or barges by the 1780s. One of these wharves was where the Conservative Club now stands. Another was just past St Andrew's Church, and the most northerly was at Ivorbury. From toll records, mills and lockkeepers took tolls for their use. We know that the river became quite profitable during the 1780s and 90s. Goods carried to Biggleswade included coal, timber and wine, whilst goods carried away from Biggleswade included barley, malt, oats and other grains. And according to a guide to Bedfordshire published 200 years ago in the very early 1800s, the River Ivor was famous for gudgeon and eels. The new locks on the river provided opportunities for eel trapping, and the fine eels of Biggleswade were a delicacy. And the tunnels come into this picture of industrialised transport along the river, because we know that each of the former wharves appears to have a tunnel entrance within their cellars. My visit to the Conservative Club. On a sunny but cold evening in early June, I was invited by local town councillor Mark Knight to visit the Conservative Club to explore the building, including the cellar. I had long heard that there was a bricked up tunnel down there, and of course I wanted to check out George's story. So let's start with George's story. George's Cavalier ghost. Sadly, there is no longer any sign of the staircase that George witnessed this spectral Cavalier on. It was bricked up some time ago. More on that later. But what I learned is that the actual site of the club has had buildings on it since medieval times. There was a vicarage, a malting barn, small holding and gardens here for centuries. During the Civil War, it's likely it was a house with malting barn and pleasure gardens. The site was originally huge, and it still is large, rather grand, with access to the river and a private island on the River Ivor. But how do we know about George's sighting? And could there have been any Cavaliers in Biggleswade? Well, I found George's story in the local newspaper. It was printed as a ghost story for Christmas in the Boxing Day edition of the Biggleswade Chronicle in 1980. The story had been conveyed to the journalist by a friend who lived on Drove Road and who had been told it by Fred, the Biggleswade brass band leader and cornet player. I checked out the band's membership during the 1930s until its demise in the mid-60s, and there was indeed a cornet-playing band leader named Fred and a trombonist named George. So the people that the story is about, check out. It appears that George's ordeal was taken seriously, and Fred and the storyteller did go and inspect the stairs, but nothing untoward was encountered. But George would not be placated so easily. His experience really had terrified him. He ceased to arrive early for band practice whilst it still took place at the Con Club, because he would not walk up those stairs and along the corridor by himself. But by the mid-30s, the band were practising in an old building along Bonds Lane, where they were less likely to disturb anyone with their music. Once they were away from the club, George was ribbed a bit for his ghost sighting, and it became something of a legend within the brass band. The storyteller and Fred revisited the Con Club in the 1950s and discovered that renovations to the building meant the stairs had been bricked up. There was a fire at the club in the late 30s, but the article implies that the renovations had happened a lot later. But why would a Cavalier soldier be haunting the Con Club? Biggleswade during the Civil War. Biggleswade didn't play a big part in the Civil War in terms of battles and fighting. In fact, Oliver Cromwell is said to have labelled the men of Biggleswade as
slow fellows and dormice,
who were
reluctant to fight.
The town came under the influence of both London and Cambridge, which were parliamentary strongholds. For those of you who are not familiar with the English Civil War, and I know I have lots of listeners who aren't from the UK, the Civil War took place in the 17th century. A group of MPs in the Parliament fell out with the King over lots of different disagreements, including religion and taxes, and the country divided along royalist or Cavalier and parliamentary lines. There were lots of battles. Eventually, the parliamentarians won with their new model army, mocked by the Cavaliers as Roundheads because of the style of their helmet. The king, Charles I, was beheaded, which was a bit of a shock, even to lots of the parliamentarians, and for around a decade England had no king. It's often referred to as the interregnum for that reason. Oliver Cromwell, the parliamentarians' leader, became what was known as Lord Protector, and basically a dictator, rampaging and massacring populations around Scotland and Ireland, where to this day he is hated by many. But once Cromwell died and handed over power to his son, yes, like a king would, England pretty much decided they'd like the old royal family back, and Charles II, the son of the beheaded king, was invited back from Europe in 1660 to what we call the Restoration. So Biggleswade was a fairly safe parliamentarian place. One thing Biggleswade is famous for during the English Civil War is for housing the Cotton Collection, or Cottonian Library, at Stratton House. The collection went on to form the basis of the British Library, and at that time comprised of ancient British artefacts, many rescued from the monasteries during the dissolution. Many of these were histories of Rome and Greece written up by the monks. Cotton, a Shropshire man originally, lived at Stratton Park, and as there was unlikely to be any fighting in and around Biggleswade, it was felt it was a safer place to keep the precious documents than its previous home in London, where it had been locked up along with Cotton himself for a time. Biggleswade was for Parliament, and the townsfolk had objected to paying Charles I's ship tax, and also the Parliament seized Biggleswade Manor from the Crown with little repercussions, selling it to the Bedford MP Thomas Margetts. Not that Margetts was much in Biggleswade, as the archives of records of his correspondence from Durham, Pontefract and Edinburgh during the Civil War. There were royalists in the town, however, including Robert Audley, who was fined for his royalist sympathies by Parliament during the interregnum when Cromwell was in charge. But by the time the monarchy were reinstated, Audley is still living in a large house and it's prosperous. It has many hearths, and that's how we know how prosperous he is, because of how much hearth tax he paid. Yes, people were taxed for the number of fireplaces they have. So it seems, although he was fined and he was a royalist, he didn't actually do too badly during the Civil War and interregnum. So could our ghost be this Robert Audley? We'll never know, but I think it's unlikely. Though if a royalist sympathiser was trying to escape Roundhead Biggleswade, then heading to the river and land adjacent to it, like where the club stands today, does make sense. And if the tunnels were in place in the 17th century, then maybe they were used to smuggle royalists down to the river. But it does seem unlikely to me. You see, it's a misnomer that all the parliamentarians in Biggleswade dressed like Puritans in sombre black. Many were wealthy, and to our eye, or that of George's in 1933, would have looked flamboyant. So he may have just seen a 17th century gentleman ghost rather than an actual Cavalier. And however thrilling the thought of a phantom Cavalier is, I don't think any escaped through the tunnels, because I think the tunnels were dug a little later than the Civil War in the 18th century. And what I discovered at the Con Club is more mysterious still. My visit to a Biggleswade cellar underneath the Con Club. I was invited to visit the club by Mark Knight, a local councillor who listens to the show. Hi Mark, and thank you again for the invite. And when I arrived, he told me he had invited 2 club members along, Mandy and Cara, who are also listeners to Weird in the Wade. They joined us on our tour of the club. Thank you again to both Cara and Mandy for agreeing to take part. So, over a drink in the bar, we chatted. Cara told me that the club still has a reputation for being haunted, and this surprised me. I was not aware of this at all. There are reports of noises late at night, glasses have flown from the bar, and shelves, and a visiting medium described the ghost of a young boy being present. One of the barmaids, in particular, has some stories to tell, and I hope to catch up with her later. We swapped other ghost stories before our tour, and I can say for definite that I will be doing more episodes related to the club and other ghostly activity there later in the series. I even learnt that Mandy has a link to one of our previous ghost stories, but I'm afraid that will have to wait for a later episode too, because I've kept you waiting long enough. Here's the audio I recorded whilst in the cellar. I think Cara expressed how we were all feeling when we entered the cellar.
This is epic.
Getting into the cellar was quite straightforward. We went down a set of ladder-type stairs into the cellar. The cellars are quite extensive, but to get to the bricked-up tunnel, we had to either crawl under the steps or jump down from them. It wasn't easy. Nope. Nope. What have I got falling down on me? Oh, it's just the snooker cues. Right. I am underneath the Conservative Club and heading towards the bricked up tunnel entrance. Basically, I've had to come behind the bar, into the cellar, down some stairs, then under the stairs in order to reach this part of the cellar where the bricked up tunnel is. It's obvious that it's been bricked up. The actual tunnel is heading towards the river, and I will of course be putting photographs onto the blog. But what's really exciting and was unexpected is that to the right of the tunnel, bricked up tunnel entrance, there is an actual tunnel that's open and you can walk round it and it curves round.
So I'm just going to explore. You can probably hear how echoey it has now become. We've got pipes hanging down. There are cobwebs. The walls are beautifully curved, you know, and the ceiling above is stone. And then it looks like it's become wood, and the roof is the wooden floorboards. And if I keep going down here, it gets very narrow because there's some old, it looks like furniture down here that's being stored. We get to stairs leading up, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 stairs that lead up into the roof or the ceiling. So I'm guessing this was the original cellar stairs. So these would have led down into the cellar. And what was above here? Would this be the bar?
That's the sports bar now.
That's the sports bar. It's with the torchlight and the shadows, it does feel rather strange down here. The bricks look really quite old. They're small, they're uneven, they're not like modern bricks. This is definitely original. I'm going to head back down. But the actual bricked up entrance then would mean that in the past you would have come down those spirally steps, you would have come into the basement as it opens out, and you would have turned to your left to go into the main basement, and then to your right there is a bricked up passageway, and it looks just like the other bricked up passageways. It's very narrow. Okay, so something really strange has just happened. I'm here taking photographs of the stairs, and Cara has got a spirit box with her app on her phone, and it just said really clearly, Beverly. And as you know, Beverly was the lady who gave me the tip off about the tunnels. She's the one that's done all the research, and she used to work here. And Mark has just said it was Beverly that first
showed me.
Yeah.
So spooky.
So in here we've got more
go
steps.
through there and then go through to the boiler room at the end.
That's mental. This is not my Disney World.
Through there, you see some interesting arches, directly in front of
yes. Now that's what some of the other bricked up tunnels look like. These arches.
And then here some more steps.
Ah, yeah.
So obviously they just use them for pipes and things.
Let's have a look. Oh yeah. Wow.
I came away from my visit with cobwebs in my hair and dust on my clothes, but it was definitely worth it. I didn't sense anything sinister in the cellar or along the little tunnel leading to the stairs. If anything, I sensed amusement at us for being down there. The tunnel entrance I found most interesting was the one next to the boiler, which was leading further south, maybe to where the old malting barn was. Maybe to the mill. There was one other space in the club that I found very atmospheric, and that was up in the meeting room towards the back of the building, upstairs. In fact, it was where the Biggleswade band had practiced. It's the oldest part of the house, dating to at least the early 18th century, and so is likely part of an older house still that was added to when the house was developed alongside the new wharf in the mid to late 18th century. It was a long, wide room with old wood beams and pillars darkened with age. It was facing west and the river overlooking the gardens. It was a very pleasant room and somewhere I would have been quite happy to sit for a long time. After our tour, and there are more stories to tell, so I will be going back in the future as I've said, I had another swift half of beer, which leads me on to why I think the Biggleswade tunnels are linked to the brewery trade. Brewing in Biggleswade. Beer was the drink of choice in the UK before universal clean water became available after several cholera outbreaks caused by contaminated water pumps and sources. The 1848 Health Act compelled local authorities to provide clean water to its citizens, though it took well into the 20th century for mains water to be supplied to all homes. The brewing process made beer far safer to drink than other sources of water. Small beer, a much lower alcohol version of the beer that we think of and drink today, had been brewed and drunk widely for centuries. Many brewed beer at home, and there were also many inns, pubs and beer houses providing this safer alternative to shared water supplies, and Biggleswade was no exception. In the mid-18th century, most of the many hostelries in Biggleswade produced their own beer in-house, and many of these brewers were women. But that was all set to change with the arrival of a group of entrepreneurs into Biggleswade. It seems at least 2 of these men were attracted by the river becoming navigable. Dennis Herbert arrived in Biggleswade in the mid-18th century. He already owned a brewery in King's Lynn and a wine and spirits merchants in Biggleswade. There is no doubt that he was exploiting the new transport link along the River Ouse and Ivell from King's Lynn to Biggleswade. He could send grain and malt up to his brewery in King's Lynn from the town, and he could bring into Biggleswade spirits and wine via the North Sea and King's Lynn. He appears in the toll books of the Ivell regularly. He was a prosperous gentleman who built himself a mansion at Ivell next to the wharf where he transported his goods to and from. His son continued to run the wine and spirits merchants well into the 19th century. Around the time Herbert arrives in Biggleswade, so did Samuel Wells, who was the son of a gamekeeper. He brought his wife and young family north to the town and in 1764 bought the King's Arms public house, maltings and associated barns, which were today where the Asda car park is and the old maltings area. At first, Samuel Wells runs the King's Arms and Brewhouse like any other pub in Biggleswade. He brews his own beer just for the use of his pub. The money used for purchasing the pub came in the form of a loan from an unmarried woman of Biggleswade, Teresa Marcia Luke. But by Wells's death in 1782, he had added 4 more pubs to his portfolio and a house on Shortmead Street. He left the business and property to his son, another Samuel Wells, who took over the business and continued its expansion. Sam Wells II married Martha Hankin of Potton, and through her family began to buy up pubs in that town as well. Then, in 1785, came the Great Fire of Biggleswade, covered in the first bonus episode of Weirdinthewade back in May 2023. The fire, which devastated the town centre, only brought opportunities to Sam Wells. None of his establishments were damaged by the fire. He quickly went into business with Dennis Herbert, the wine and spirits merchants from King's Lynn, with the other wharf and mansion at Ivell, and along with another King's Lynn brewer, George Hogg, they together bought up many of the sites where pubs, inns and beer houses had been destroyed, rebuilding them under the Wells Company name. I'm wondering if at this point, with so many malting barns and pubs destroyed, if Wells, whose main site had been untouched, started to sell his beer to other hostelries in Biggleswade, a practice that would continue. They were a captive market at the time, and he was clearly a man with an eye for an opportunity. Not only was he buying up land from these pubs and inns where they had once stood before the fire, he was also rebuilding them from the ground up. This was the perfect opportunity to add some tunnels connecting the basements and cellars of his establishments. By 1810, Wells's company owned 12 pubs in Biggleswade, and at this point Herbert and Hogg gave up their stakes in the brewery, concentrating on other interests. Samuel Wells continued to buy up property and in particular bought land around the original's King's Arms site, which he had demolished and rebuilt as Biggleswade Bank. By 1831, he owned 46 pubs. No less than 18 were outside Biggleswade. He also owned a huge amount of land where he built his brewery behind the Biggleswade Bank. Sam Wells's daughters, Frances and Elizabeth, married into two important local families who were in business with Wells, the Linsells and the Hoggs, mentioned earlier. The Linsells had run one of Biggleswade's mills for many years and are still a prominent family in Biggleswade. These two sons-in-law were left the business on Sam Wells's death, and they and their sons continued to run and expand the business until 1899, when they finally sold it to George Winch. At that point, they sold 99 parcels of property, the vast majority being pubs, inns and beer houses, all of which include additional barns, malting shops and cottages. In Biggleswade alone, in 1899, the company owned and was selling the large brewery site where Asda stands today, the Crown Inn, including a jeweller's shop next to the inn, the Swan Inn, the White Horse, the Half Moon, the Biggleswade Club, the former Chequers site in town, the Coach and Horses on Shortmead Street, the former Black Horse Beer House in Cowfairlands, the Eiffel Hotel, Royal Oak, Horse and Jockey, the Anchor, the Wheatsheaf, the Old Spread Eagle Brew House, the Chequers on Potton Road, the Hotbine, the Yorkshire Grey, the White Lion, the Bay Horse, Shoulder of Mutton, Bridge House Beer House, the Woolpack, Railway Tavern, George Hotel, Nag's Head, the Dolphin, the Two Brewers, the New Inn, the White Hart and the Plough. 5 of these pubs are still open today, though the New Inn is now a Vietnamese restaurant. So why is this history lesson in late 18th and 19th century brewing in Biggleswade so important when it comes to the tunnels? My theory. So my theory about why the tunnels were built beneath Biggleswade is that they were built and used by Wells, Herbert, Linsell and Hogg and their other business partners for storing and transporting beer and other goods around the town and to the river. We know that the tunnels appear to originate from the old brewery. We have the workmen back in 2000 digging up the road to lay new sewer pipes, telling us that at least one tunnel headed straight down towards that old brewery. We know that the site of these old pubs and existing ones have bricked up tunnels in their cellars. The tunnels appear to lead down to the 3 wharves on the River Ivel that were owned and run by Herbert and Wells and their other business partners. Even the owners of the Con Club Wharf had a share in the Wells Company at one time, and Sam Wells lived in the Middle Wharf for many, many years. It also makes a lot of sense because by the 19th century, Wells is providing beer to most, if not all, of the town. Even if he doesn't own the pub or inn, he's providing their beer. He also has a bank. The safest and most efficient way to store and transport beer, goods and maybe even money and gold is going to be along these tunnels underground for all kinds of reasons. One reason always mentioned is smuggling, and maybe that was part of it. Tracking what's moved is much harder for the authorities if tunnels are used. You could have an above-ground transaction of goods where taxes are paid, and then a below-ground one that no one knows about. But even if smuggling and tax evasion was not the motivation, I can see how distributing the beer barrels and moving goods down to the river would run more smoothly underground. It would also be a lot more secure and safe. The beer is only going to sit in the cellar of the pub anyway, so why not deliver it straight there? Along the river, it seems that the tunnels may have opened out at a level where loading them onto barges would have been easy and convenient. There is one curious aspect though, and that is the tunnel beneath Camden House School. Why would the tunnel stretch that far? We know that the Hoggs had a spirit and wine merchants on Stratton Street, and I wonder if it was in that Camden House building before it became a school. And interestingly, the Hoggs disappear from Biggleswade back to Norfolk in around the mid-19th century, at about the time that the school opens. What does seem clear, though, is that the tunnel along Stratton Street would not have been much use after 1850 because once the railway came through Biggleswade, it will have cut the tunnel in two. The tracks are surely lower than any tunnel was. It would be great to find any mention of the tunnels being discovered when the railway was being built, but I've not found anything yet. For me, though, one of the most compelling pieces of evidence I discovered was around Samuel Wells building up the new pubs after the fire, because to me it gives him the perfect opportunity to add these tunnels to his new buildings. We know there were extensive cellars anyway, which probably survived the fire, so it wasn't going to be much more work to link some of them up and link them to his brewery. Why were the tunnels bricked up? I'm guessing initially the tunnels became less useful once the railway arrived in Biggleswade. At this point, the River Ivel stopped being used so regularly, and by 1876 it's described as seldom used by barges. By 1900, I have a guide to Biggleswade that describes the river as impassable in anything larger than a rowing boat. I would imagine that the heyday of these tunnels would have been from the 1780s to the 1850s. But we do have a witness who says he walked through the tunnels as a child down to the river, so at least some of them were still open in the 1960s and 70s. The general consensus around town is that some of the tunnels were initially blocked up during the Second World War. The Spickers part of the tunnel system and cellar system was actually used as air raid shelters in front of where the White Hart pub is now. It's understandable that you wouldn't have wanted children to go wandering off down those tunnels when sheltering down there during air raids. Then the next major effort to block up the tunnels took place in the late 80s, when the new bus station in town was built adjacent to the market square. Tunnels were found when the foundations were being laid and were blocked up for health and safety reasons. Obviously, individual shops and pubs and houses could choose to brick up the entrances at any time after they stopped serving a purpose. Are the tunnels haunted? The tunnels have certainly haunted the town's imagination, and I think that stories about them have grown up due to a lack of clarity as to where they are, where they lead, and what they were used for. It's easy to imagine shadowy monks, priests, smugglers and body snatchers creeping below ground through flickering torchlight. It's certainly a spookier image than rolling beer barrels along and loading up barges with grain. There's also the fact that the tunnels appear in the cellars of old buildings in Biggleswade, buildings with a history, and so are more likely to have tales of hauntings attached to them. And even where the setting of the haunting is more modern, like the Pound Stretcher for example, the cellar is picked out as a centre for creepiness because cellars and tunnels are creepy. Why the bricked up tunnel entrance below Camden House has that window in front of it just adds to the creepiness. Do smells and sounds permeate through the bricked up entrances? We certainly have people that tell us that they do. I will definitely be returning to the subject of tunnels in general in the future, exploring the ghost stories we attach to these subterranean passageways, whether it's ghosts of the London Underground or haunted vintage railway tunnels, smugglers' tunnels in Cornwall, mining tunnels the world over, or the many haunted road tunnels of Japan. It seems that some humans just don't like being in tunnels very much. I will keep digging for more information about Biggleswade's tunnels and will bring you what I find out in later episodes. That is a promise. And please keep listening right to the end, as just 2 days before this episode is due out, I am making a trip to the Bedfordshire archives to look at plans of the brewery, and I'll update you if I find anything significant. So far, I've not heard a ghost story specifically about the tunnels themselves. Probably because so few people have actually been in them. What I have heard are ghost stories about the buildings above them. So I can't say I believe the tunnels are haunted, but I am sure that they are eerie and claustrophobic and probably quite dank and disgusting now after being blocked up for so long. One other reason why there may be a link between the tunnels and unusual phenomenon is that they are somehow having an environmental impact on the buildings above them. Now, I'm not saying they are, I'm saying they might be. Does sound carry through them? What of the railway noise and infrasound? Now, infrasound is a low frequency noise, and if you listen to Uncanny, you'll be well aware of this. It's a low frequency noise which can carry a sense of dread or fear in people exposed to it. So we can't hear it with our ears, and we can't even feel it as a vibration because it's so low. But instead, we can still sense it, and it affects us in a way that makes us feel dread and fear. Railways, heavy goods vehicles and machinery can sometimes generate this type of sound, and with the A1 and the railway so close to Biggleswade, could the tunnels be amplifying this infrasound or vibrations caused by them? It's just a thought. What is clear is that they're a fascinating feature of the town. Camden House Schoolroom. The day after my visit to the Biggleswade Con Club cellar, I met with another of Biggleswade's town councillors, this time Andy Skilton, at the Labour Hall. I wanted to have a good snoop around to see whether I could prove once and for all if the building was the schoolroom for Camden House School in the late 19th and early 20th century. I'd like to thank Andy for his time, and he was also able to give me some information I'll tell you about after you hear my recording from my visit. I'm in the Labour Hall this morning. You can probably hear the echo. It's always been quite an echoey place, the Labour Hall. Good for giving rousing speeches. I'm standing at the far end of the Labour Hall and looking down to the other end, and I'm not very good at distance, but this is definitely schoolroom sized. It's a long, narrow building. The windows are high up. They're at least, I'm guessing, nearly 6 foot off the ground. You're not going to be able to look through and see what's going on outside. You can see the sky, but you can't really see anything else. And that is perfect for a Victorian school. You can imagine the rows of benches and forms that they would have been sitting on, or their little desks with the inkwells, and the windows are high up, so there's light coming in and they can see the sky, but they're not going to be distracted by people walking past. So that definitely, I'm pretty certain that this definitely was the schoolroom. I'm just going to move through. This is where the main doors are, and I'm guessing this would have been the case back in the 19th century and early 20th century. Kids would have poured in through here. Maybe behind us is where they had storerooms and things for the teachers, maybe where the teachers could take a break sometimes. And then looking straight down into the end of the hall would have been where we would have had the benches, as I've said, and the kids sitting there looking forward to the teacher, who would have been up on a raised platform. Now there is, this building used to actually be longer, and I remember it from the 1980s, where I would come to the Labour Hall either with my mum for meetings or for the church service, because the Pentecostal church is just the other side of this building, and now they're two separate halls, but in the 1980s it was one big, really long hall, and we know that there were 2 schoolrooms for Camden House School, so that makes sense that it was this room that was used as a schoolroom and then one further behind it. And it may even have been that they had this for girls and the one behind it was for boys. I'm just going to go out because there is a little courtyard here where I have organised barbecues in the past. It's a little bit windy, but out here leads through to another courtyard, and I can see the back of Camden House. And it would have been so easy for the teachers at Camden House just to come through this courtyard and into the school. They would have had direct access. It's just so obvious now that this is definitely the old schoolroom. And we know that there were gardens here as well. So maybe the kids were allowed to come out here at breaks and run around in the gardens that basically are behind old Camden House. There's a lot of ivy, and there's, I'm guessing, a big wall that all the ivy's growing on, but we know that the burger shack, which is just to the other side of this wall from the courtyard, has also got a lovely courtyard garden where you can go and drink cocktails. And I'm guessing this wall probably wasn't here, and it was all one big yard for the kids to play in and do sports in as well. So
it's really great to actually be here, and also to think that the white building I'm looking at now, Camden House, beneath that building is an entrance to a tunnel where, before the railway line came to Biggleswade, you could go into that tunnel and walk all the way down underground, we suspect, all the way to the Conservative Club and the river where I was last night. It's an astounding thought. Similarly, you could have come down into the tunnels here, and you could have walked all the way into town and then up along Shortmead Street, up to Ivelberry, further north on the River Ivel. So I think it's been really useful coming here today, and it has definitely confirmed for me that this was the schoolroom. And I think I might have just spied where there was a back door to the schoolroom, because I can see a bricked up shape and it's taller than a window. I can't see if it goes all the way down, so I'm just going to go and have a peek through the gate, because there's a hole in the gate. I'm not going to open the gate because it's a fire exit, but I suspect that goes all the way down. In fact, I can probably just sneak into the courtyard on my way out of here to confirm that, and I will let you know if I've spotted the back door to the schoolhouse where the teachers would have come in. Well, there goes a train. You can hear how close we are to the railway, and of course that put the end to the tunnel going all the way into Biggleswade from here. But yeah, I reckon that's the back door that the teachers would have come through.
I was able to sneak round into the courtyard beyond the Labour Hall and was able to confirm that there was a back door, which has long been bricked up. It's directly opposite a door leading from Camden House itself. It would have been only a matter of a few footsteps for the teachers at Camden House to walk from their home and music rooms into the schoolhouse. This seems like proof indeed that the Labour Hall was once formally associated with Camden House School. Andy was also able to tell me a few things about the river. He's a keen fisherman with his own YouTube fishing channel, The Budget Angler. I'm pleased to say that the River Ivel in Biggleswade is a thriving place for wildlife. Gudgeon are still caught in the Ivel, and Andy has seen eels there too, along with other wildlife, including kingfishers. It is a relief to know that the Ivel is doing so well when so many other rivers in the UK are suffering. Andy also told me that he has a few stories that he's keen to share with Weirdinthewade. He even said to me those fateful words, "I don't believe in ghosts, but..." I'm not going to spoil it for you, but later this year I will be covering a fantastic story from Andy, and of course I will be revisiting the stories Cara and Mandy shared with me about the Con Club and the old police station, now the Sea Cadets Hall. And finally, as promised, here's my last minute update on my visit to the Bedfordshire archives. I'm recording this the day before this episode is released, so very last minute. I visited the archives on a brilliantly sunny Friday. Bedford was looking at its best. I shared some photos on social media, and more than one person said that the court buildings and along the River Ouse looked not unlike Bruges. The archives are in a riverside building, but one that's more brutalist than Bruges. The staff at the archives were lovely, friendly and very helpful. I had submitted a request for a number of documents relating to the river, properties associated with the wharves in Biggleswade and the brewery. So the first thing to say is I found some lovely postcards of the River Ivel in Biggleswade from the 1900s to the 1920s. There used to be a tea room and boats to hire near to where Franklin Recreation Ground is today. It just looks so genteel and pretty. I really wish we still had that in Biggleswade. I also discovered through the will of William Pope, who owned the Ivelberry Wharf and House in the late 19th century. At that point, the wharf was known as Pope's Wharf. that at some point in the past, money had been paid to the owner of an adjoining meadow for the digging of foundations and underground works. However, it was said to be for a chimney stack to be built, though it seemed very large indeed for a chimney at 107 square feet. And why there'd be a need to dig foundations under a meadow for a chimney on Pope's own land, I am not sure. I found the details of the sale of Riverside House, previously known as Riverfield House, by the Powers sisters. They sound like a 1980s girl group. Now, the Powers briefly owned the wharf at what is now the Con Club and were in business with Sam Wells's company. So I thought Riverside House must be the Con Club house. And some of the description definitely matches it, but other details seem to be different. What's for certain is it was a grand house on the riverbanks with extensive cellars and outbuildings and barns, but no mention of tunnels. I also looked at a number of old tithe maps, one of which was for Biggleswade, but was sadly for north of Biggleswade along Furzon Hall Road and towards the Common. This will no doubt prove useful for later episodes, but not for the river. Finally, I looked at the 1960s plans of Biggleswade Brewery, which must have been drawn up when Greene King acquired the business in 1967. Greene King ran the brewery for another 30 years. The plans do not indicate tunnels, but they do indicate extensive cellars, as you might expect. The keg cellar was right at the front of the building, exactly where it's estimated that the tunnel running along Abbott's Walk was heading towards. By the 60s, the beer was being transported by lorry, and there is a loading bay indicated above the cellar to the west. My favourite find at the archives, though, was a painting, estimated to be 240 years old. It was found, appropriately enough, in the spirit cellar of the brewery when it was being prepared for demolition in 1997. It's a charming painting of what is guessed to be Samuel Wells Sr., which means it's likely to have been painted in the 1780s before his death, or maybe close after it. It's a modest picture, almost a sketch of him, yet his face is very alive. He wears a russet-coloured cap on his head, and at his neck is a beautiful indigo and red neckerchief. He has white hair, a large nose, and his mouth is straight, but his eyes are kindly and smiling. He wears the outfit of a brewer, a heavy black coat and pale apron over it, but beneath the black coat can be glimpsed a clean, white shirt and breeches which look expensive. His stockings are a pale turquoise and ribbed, and his shoes are good leather and fashionable. He is the perfect picture of a late 18th century working man made good. There are hints at his prosperity, but he is standing amongst his beer barrels, dressed for work. It's a charming picture, which I'll share on the blog. I am very grateful to the Bedfordshire Archives for giving me access to these documents. Although I did not find definitive proof of the tunnel's existence or their purpose, I do have a greater sense of who Samuel Wells was and how the River Ivell looked 100 years ago. I will keep researching the tunnels, and if anyone listening has any information you'd like to share with me, please do get in touch at weirdinthewade@gmail.com or on social media. We're pretty much everywhere as Weird in the Wade. And I'd say that I'm 99% sure that the tunnels were built after the Great Fire of Biggleswade by Samuel Wells as a way to maintain his beer business, to transport his beer barrels not only to the pubs in Biggleswade but down to the wharves. And I'm guessing they fell out of use in the mid-19th century when it became easier to transport beer by rail, and maybe it was easier to transport the beer to the pubs in the town at that point overground by carriage. Next time on Weird in the Wade, I've solved the mystery of Murder Bridge, and I still can't quite believe it. As is often the case in life, I stumbled across the answer to the riddle whilst researching something else. I went on a roller coaster ride for this story, and it's a wild one. It's not like anything I've told before on the podcast. A ghost story in the 1920s led me to a libel case in the 1870s, a famous spiritualist from Biggleswade, Shakespeare, a treasure hunt in Kirkstall Abbey, and a letter to Scotland Yard, all of which led me to discover the identity of a woman who was found dead beneath a bridge 170 years ago near Biggleswade, and which of the two bridges was labelled as Murder Bridge. All will be revealed in next month's episode of Weird in the Wade. And July's Patreon episode is going to be about sleep paralysis, including my own experiences of the condition. I promise you it's not one for the faint-hearted. Head over to Patreon to join and get access to bonus content. There's a link in the show description wherever you're listening now. So there is a lot to look forward to. Thank you. This month, I'd like to say a huge thank you to those of you who have supported the podcast through Ko-fi and Patreon. And they are: thank you to Paul Day, Lisa B, Anonymous, Leslie, Stephen, Sally Robinson, Fiona Scott Doran, Abby Hagger, PJ Zimmerlink, Emma Butler, Felicity Fenton, Ian Peacock, Claire Kendall and John Hawkes, as well as saying thank you to Helen the Cat and Hugh Murden. Thank you all so much for your support. And thank you to everyone listening who has made it this far. Remember, one of the best ways to support the show is to review or rate us wherever you're listening currently. You can also vote for Weird in the Wade for the Listener's Choice Award at the British Podcast Awards. I've shared a link in the show description. Thank you again for listening. Today's episode was researched, written, presented and produced by me, Nat Doig, with special thanks to Councillor Mark Knight at the Conservative Club and Cara and Mandy for their contributions. Thank you to Beverly Swain for sharing her insights into the tunnels. Thank you to Councillor Andy Skilton at the Labour Hall for giving me access to the Labour Hall. Thank you. And thank you to the Bedfordshire Archives. Theme music is by Tess Savagear. The Camelot Monastery Gregorian chant music was by Darren Curtis. And all other music and sound effects were from Epidemic Sound.